I'd like to show a game between two British grandmasters, John Nahn and Nigel Short. The game was played in the Spanish Opening, in the closed variation of the Spanish Opening. So these are all the very common moves. Both players develop their pieces, and White is preparing to advance in the center with d4. So he plays h3 to avoid the pin with bishop g4. Black also advances some pawns to put pressure on the center. And we arrived at the so-called closed variation of the Spanish Opening. In this line, in the Chigorin line, White has another. Black has another option in addition to knight c6, which is to instead take on d4, and after c takes d4 to play the same move, knight c6, but now with the c file being already closed, and this leads to slightly different structure and slightly different play and strategies from both sides. But in this game, knight c6 was played, and White uses that to advance the pawn to d5 and gain some extra space. So the knight retreats, and here White played knight to f1, but there was another very well-known game in the same position that went slightly differently, and I'd like to show that game between Karpov and Unziker, just to show the typical ideas of this line very quickly. A4, rook b8. At this point we see that the struggle for the A file is evolving, and the A file, as we'll see, is very important in the structure. With this great maneuver, Karpov managed to double up on the A file, and he later proceeds with the expansion on the king side as well. Goes f4, and here Black should have probably just taken on d4. On f4. Instead, he allowed White to advance the pawn to f5. And White gained even more space this way, and after g5 all of Black's pieces were very tangled up, and they couldn't really place, they couldn't find any better squares, and the only reasonable piece that Black has is this bishop, and Karpov traded off the bishop and completely dominated the light squares pretty soon. And this knight is coming here, and Black is just very passive, so he resigned. He just couldn't bear this anymore. He lost the A file, he lost the space, and he lost the light squares on the king side. So this idea of f4 or 5 is useful to keep in mind. F4 or 5 is useful to keep in mind. In this game, Nahn played knight f1 first, but then he still carried on with the very much the same plan. Here he prepares the same idea of f4, and he plays rook f1 first. Here Black played what was probably an inaccuracy. He should have anticipated f4 and played something like f6, and then the idea is that after f4 he has time to play knight to f7, and then this knight is going to come to e5 and occupy this great outpost here. White will probably have to trade at some point. And if the knight comes to g4, then Black just trades off on g4 and still has time to play knight to e5. And this is playable for Black. Instead here, Black decided that he wants to fight for the A file, and he'd better connect the rooks as soon as possible. So he went bishop to d7, which is a bit of an inaccuracy. After f4 he doesn't have time to prepare f6 and knight to e5. So say if he goes takes and then f6, then White is already coming with knight to g4, and after say knight to f7, knight h6 follows, and black can't put a good piece on the e5 square. White still has more space. Black's kingside is a bit loose. This is quite nice for white. So after f4, instead of capturing, he played bishop to h4, sort of counter-attacking. Now hitting the knight on g3. White defends the knight. And again, there is the threat of f5, just like in the Karpov game, after which it would be difficult for black to play g5, and it's a threat. So black goes f5 himself. This means that the game is going to open up, and his passively placed pieces, which may be okay for defending, they're not so good for counterattacking or for playing the open position. So the game opens up further. And again, black is suffering from the fact that the rooks are not connected, so he cannot, for example, take on e4 here, because that would just be the end of the game. So this fact that black is running out of space makes it difficult for him to connect the rooks, and that makes it difficult for him to prepare for the opening of the files. So he has to recapture on e5, and now white opens up the game further. If he takes on f5 now, then this knight will probably take on f5, or at some point. So black eliminates that knight on g3. White recaptures, and then knight comes to f5, and white again builds up this pressure on the f file, and maybe even g4 is threatened at the moment, say. So black has to hurry to connect the rooks. So now at least the b8 rook is guarding the f8 rook, and now white builds up the pressure by bringing his least active piece into the game. So he goes knight to g4. And this creates some unpleasant threats of maybe this knight would come to f6. It's putting pressure on the e5 pawn. White wants to play something like bishop to g5 and then come to f6 with a knight, possibly. So there's quite a multitude of threats coming from this move, and the white's pieces are generally placed much more active. So just to see what could happen, say, if black plays innocently, and say tries to exchange the rooks on the a file. Again, the a file is a factor here. Then simply exchange, and now there's just not enough pieces on the king side. The queen is not defending the king side as well as it should. So knight h6, and after takes, simply it's very hard to stop either this or queen to f7. So black has to give up a pawn, and white doesn't even have to take that pawn, because now something like d6 just wins. Takes with a knight, then queen e5, and the king is just completely exposed. White wins the rook. So playing in a natural way is difficult here for black, so he decided to sharpen up the play a little bit and counterattack with h5. This seems like it's forcing the knight to either go to h6 or to retreat, and then black could kind of play king g7 and consolidate a little bit. But what black missed here was that the play here is happening not only on the king side, but that white still has this open a file, and even though there isn't much going on that file, the rook is still placed very well, and by weakening the king side with h5, he exposed the g6 pawn, and now this invited this counter strike from white. So none played rook to a6. This hit g6, and it turns out that there's just too many threats. If say he goes and tries to protect the pawn with king h7, then knight to f6, and with simple moves white builds up a crushing attack. If he takes a piece, then more sacrifices follow, and the king is just too weak. The pawn, the queen, and the bishop are just enough to attack this king. Check, and the queen falls. Black played here king to e7, then again the attack is crushing. So in this position, Nigel Short had nothing better than capturing on g4, but then his position collapsed anyway, because after knight g7, white is still crushing in the sacrifice rook to g7, and the black king is getting mated. So if he takes, further sacrifices follow. Check, check, checkmate. This is a very instructive game that shows the connection between the two sides of the board, and Nan exploited very well the fact that he still controlled the A file, and as soon as white weakened the king side enough, he utilized his open file and came in with the rook, attacking the pawn on the 6th rank and winning the game.